Welcome to this week's reflection, and what a doozy it is. We'll be talking about Gates and then Heidegger and Kristava. First, going to talk about Gates because I really loved his idea about what signifying was and how it is, in my mind, the same yet different from semiotics, and I'll try to explain that. And something I really found interesting, and it seemed like something we struggled with, was signifying as a concept of being a rhetorical act. And um, Gates has a great quote about that. It's on page 988. The signifying it is clear in black discourse means modes of figuration itself. When one signifies, as Kimberly W. Benson puns, one tropes a dope. Indeed, the black tradition itself has its own subdivisions of signifying, which we could readily identify with the typology of figures received from classical and medieval rhetoric, as Bloom has done with his map of misprisons. I think I pronounced that. But the black rhetorical tropes subsumed under signifying would include marking, loud talking, testifying, calling out one's name, sounding, rapping, playing the dozens, and so on. I really like that, he talks about rhetorical ways of communicating as being signifying, because I feel like that's where we struggled, is because when we talk about it in like a traditional sense of the sign and the signified and the signifier, all that stuff, like the signifier is the words used to describe a thing, like a tree. So a signifier would be tree, and the signified is the concept of tree that pops into your mind. I really like that, trips us up, but that is literally a form of communication. I mean, when we read poetry or we read novels, we're always like, what is the author trying to say, or what are they trying to communicate? And it's a weird disconnect that the signified, all of that stuff of semiotics in writing and trying to figure out what they mean was like hard for us to see the correlation between signifying being a rhetorical act of communication. And I really, really love that Gates brought that up, and it challenged a lot of us to think about signifying in a way, and some of the ideas of what signifying would be in their why one would do that. I think Gates has a quote about signifying being a way for one to subvert the traditions held about oneself, or even to change one's own view of oneself, I think. And I couldn't help but think of like the idea of stunting and like flexing on people to make yourself feel good, and how that could be a form of signifying. And if we took it in a semiotic sense, like what is the like whatever I'm wearing signifying to others, and that's a rhetorical thing. Like I wanted to do a project, I'm now just rambling because I can, on the rhetoric of battle jackets, or whatever you want to call them, like punk jackets that people wear. What do those signify to people? And those could be seen in the same light if you examine them. Like, what does this patch signify? And then look at it in the stunting, or not the stunting sense, the signifying sense of Gates. And there's an easy connection there when you try to read something physically as well as trying to read it in terms of an act of communication. Maybe I'm just making shit up in my head now that I'm talking about it. Now I'm lost. I'm going to stop. But that's what I really liked about Gates, and there you go, I'm back on track, is the idea that signifying was contextual, and there are many forms of signifying, because I think when looking at semiotics, like what a word is conveying is also contextual because of the words attached to it. Like with SZ, I didn't actually get to read it, but from what I'm seeing is Barth is going line by line, and that's a thing that, like, the sentence is the smallest unit that we can go on. I mean, poetry breaks out, but even syntactically, there are rules that govern how those things connect. Now I'm off on a tangent, so I'm going to stop. Go to Heidegger and Kristava, because they were really interesting and both kind of hard to follow. Like, my biggest thing, and we mentioned it in classes, I think they were talking about, like, Heidegger in the sense is talking about metacognition, the act of thinking about the thinking. Like, he's talking about philosophy and like how we ponder our existence and what the implications of something that can do that are. At least that's kind of what I got out of him. maybe there's other things, but like I think he was trying to get at metacognition and the idea of how our brain functions and creates the world around us, and how the process of turning all of this chaotic stimuli around us into a cohesive picture in our mind that makes sense, and how that works. I think that's what he's talking about, and what he's trying to get at is how can we do that and what makes us do that. Whereas Kristava, I think, is talking about cognition in the same way, but I think she's laying out how we end up doing these things. And like, I really liked her Cora stage and the Thadic stage, and it sounded like the 6 month stage. And I'm going to equate this to an experiment that I've seen done, and it's an interesting thing. You can look online. Like, it's called the mirror experiment, and what they do is they place a mirror and like have animals like in the natural environment come up to it, and they won't recognize that it's themselves. So like, you'll see a video, and it's kind of hilarious. You'll see a video of a tiger stumble up onto the mirror of itself, and it'll look at it and it'll be like, what is this? Or if you've had a cat and they do that in the mirror where they like fight themselves, I think that that is what Kristava is talking about, is if we don't get past that stage, like signifying and signifiers and how we make sense of the world and making those connections with language and whatnot don't really matter. I don't think she's saying they don't really matter. I think she's saying that they're not as primal of importance, because I feel like it would be ignorant to say that animals don't communicate when clearly they do. I mean, cats have imitated babies' cries with the meows they give to humans because they realize that we're suckers for that, you know. And then other animals communicate with themselves echolocation. So I'm not saying that there isn't communication, but like making sense of the world around it beyond what other things are, and just communicating with yourself and kind of surviving is what Kristava, I think, is trying to explore. And I think that that's where they both are, is they're looking at cognition, and in Heidegger's case, metacognition. In Kristava's case, I think she's actually trying to look at like the stages and how the brain functions to make those things work. But that is what I got out of those, and correct me if I'm wrong. I'm going to stop that here because I feel like I'm at like, 7 minutes. Yeah. So hopefully that made sense and was worth discussing. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your week.